All right, this will be 2.9 photosynthesis. So, kind of interesting to do this one right after cell respiration because we're going to see some similarities, a surprising amount of similarities, but some opposites. So, photosynthesis is basically the opposite of cell respiration. Cell respiration, you're tearing apart sugar to make ATP, so that's catabolic, right? In the presence of oxygen, usually, unless it's anaerobic. Photosynthesis, right? Synthesize means to make something using light. Photo is light. So we're going to be putting small stuff together to build. So photosynthesis is anabolic. It's a building overall reaction. So pretty easy to think of the reactants. Just think about what a plant needs. You need water, so you got to water your plant or else it dies. And then it needs CO2. So it's just the opposite of our cell respiration. The products of cell respiration, you breathe out CO2 onto a plant. The plant can use that CO2 to make its glucose, and then you eat the plant, you get the glucose, you tear it apart, back and forth. It's this really nice cycle that we talked about with the carbon cycle already. So water and CO2 go in, oxygen and glucose are products. All right. So a little bit more about energy. We already talked about this in topic 4 with ecosystems. Energy can't be created or destroyed. We're just converting it from light energy, from the electromagnetic radiation of those photons. That was a wave. Being converted into the chemical energy of glucose. Okay, so photo is light. Yeah, synthesis, making stuff. Pretty simple. Right, so unlike cell respiration, part of cell respiration takes place in the cytoplasm, that's glycolysis, and then the rest of it's in the mitochondria. But photosynthesis, none of it takes place in the cytoplasm. It's a little bit different there. All of photosynthesis is just in the chloroplast. So yeah, that's just for eukaryotes. For some prokaryotes can do photosynthesis and they don't have a chloroplast, but exceptions to every rule. So that's what goes in. We already talked about that. Glucose and oxygen come out. And there's the equation. That box should be an arrow, some formatting issues. And again, if you want to balance it, you just throw some 6s in there. Yeah, so the way to remember the reactants, you got to water the plant. And if you talk to your plant, it'll actually grow a little bit faster, maybe, if you lean in close and breathe really heavy. Yeah, so it's the opposite of cell respiration, right? Opposite and opposite. I don't like these equations because it says energy is a reactant or a product. That doesn't make sense. Energy can't be created or destroyed. What it should mean is for photosynthesis, light energy turning into chemical energy. And for this one, the energy from the glucose giving you energy as ATP, just converting from one molecule to another. So overall, photosynthesis is 2 parts. We're going to do the light stuff first, which should make sense. You need energy to do anything. So we're going to start with harnessing the power of light so we can do some stuff. And then we're going to use that energy to make our compounds. And again, we see the production of high energy compounds which need to be used immediately, right? These high energy compounds don't last very long, so you need to use them immediately. So the 2 that we're going to make are ATP, of course, ATP is everywhere, and we're also going to make NADPH. This extra P, this is like NADH, but it's got an extra phosphate in it. Okay, overall, not a big deal. You can think of the P as standing for plant or photosynthesis. So it was cell respiration, you make and use NADH. In photosynthesis, you make and use NADPH. Okay, so we're going to do that in the light-dependent reactions because we depend on light, and then we're going to use them. We're going to use those energy carriers to link the CO2s together to make glucose, right? You need 6 CO2s and some water to make glucose. Okay, cool. And again, by use, I don't mean completely destroy. I just mean take the NADPH and turn it into NADP plus. Take the ATP, turn it into ADP, and then re-energize the ADP in step 1. Okay, it's just a cycle. All right, so we're going to capture the light energy to make the energy carriers to make glucose. Again, you got that intermediate step. We're trying to put carbon-carbon bonds together, and this all starts with water. Water is low energy, so whatever we get from water has to be zapped. Right, so let's do light dependent first, right? Comes before light independent. We're going to need light to do anything, so light dependent comes first. It's also alphabetical. Dependent comes before independent in the alphabet. So we're going to use chlorophyll chloroplasts are filled with chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is a molecule. The chloroplast is a big organelle. So make sure you don't mix those up. So the chlorophyll absorbs the light, mostly red and blue, not really green, and then transfers that red or blue photon of light energy into water, and that splits water. And hopefully you remember the root for split is lysis. And because we're using light to split something, it's called photolysis or photolysis. I usually pronounce it photolysis just so you can really see the roots in there, but it's pronounced photolysis. So photo means light, lysis means split. You can imagine it also, this is technically hydrolysis because we are splitting water using light, but the vocab term for this is photolysis. Okay? So when you split water, you get three things. You get oxygen, and oxygen is a waste product, so the plant just releases it. Their trash is our treasure. Thanks for the oxygen. We also get two other things. We get high energy electrons because we're using light here. Water itself isn't high energy, but because we zap it with light, it becomes high energy electrons. We also get some H's from H2O, and that's gonna be what we use to make ATP and an ADPH. Okay, and we'll talk a lot more detail about that next year in topic 8, but for now that's good. Okay, so there's the water, there's the electrons, there's the hydrogens, the oxygens, right? Okay, so just showing how these two interplay. Light dependent first, make the energy carriers. Light independent second, use the energy carriers and make a bunch of glucose. This is what we're after. Okay, we also make some oxygen. Is that missing? Yeah, oxygen is also released when you split water at the beginning. All right, so really interesting. You would suffocate if you lived on the planet billions of years ago, more than 2.5 billion years ago. There wasn't a lot of oxygen, and then life evolved photosynthesis, and that photosynthesis actually put so much oxygen in the air that it significantly changed it. We're at 20 point something percent oxygen in the air right now. And we know this because we can look at the rock layers. We can look at more than 2.5 billion years ago. The rocks, the minerals in the rocks aren't very oxidized. And then after you hit that mark where photosynthesis took off like crazy, we started to see a lot more oxidation in the rock layer. Okay. So plants don't use all the wavelengths. If they did, they would be black. If they didn't use any wavelengths of light, they would be white. But they use some, and that's what gives them a color, and anything that has a color is called a pigment. And all a pigment is it absorbs some wavelengths of light and reflects the others. So this green pen is green because it's absorbing all the photons in this white light coming from the artificial light in the sun, all that visible light, and reflects green. The green photons don't interact with it as much. Okay, so the pigment, the main pigment in plants is chlorophyll, and you do need to know these numbers. Visible light is between 400 and 700 nanometers. So what a wavelength is, you have these photons of light traveling through the air, and that gives you this sinusoidal wave. And the length of this wave from one trough to the next is called the wavelength, usually abbreviated Greek letter lambda, but that's the wavelength. And visible light is between 400 and 700 nanometers. So those are numbers you need to know. The shorter wavelength has higher energy, and so that's violet. Longer wavelength is lower energy, and that's red. So that's why I like going like this, because like short wavelength, high energy. So chlorophyll mostly absorbs red and blue and reflects green. That's why plants look green, because they're everything but green, essentially. Cool. If you shine green light on a plant, it's really not going to grow very well. And they don't use green. Kind of interesting to see similar structures between chlorophyll and hemoglobin. But, yeah. Oh, and this was a project done by a student a couple of years ago. They had an unhealthy obsession with a hockey player named Phil Kessel. So chlorophyll. Anyway, you can hear that. Weird. All right. So absorption spectrum. This is a vocab term. The absorption. So spectrum. That's a range of whatevers. In this case, we're talking about a range of wavelengths. And absorption means to absorb, not reflect. So the spectrum of wavelengths absorbed by, the most important thing here is a specific pigment. So you have the absorption spectrum of one pigment. And then the vocab term on the next slide is all the pigments working together. So the most common absorption spectrum we'll talk about is chlorophyll, because that's the most common photosynthetic pigment. Okay, so you need this drawn and labeled. You can call the x-axis either color or wavelength. Yeah, technically if it was wavelength, you'd have red on this side because it's shorter, but that's fine if you screw that up. So you need to know there's a big peak at blue. Yeah, you can get some violet in there too, but the important thing is big peak at blue, almost zero green. That means it's reflected. That's why chlorophyll is green. And then a smaller peak at red. So plants really absorb blue very well, and they absorb red pretty well, but chlorophyll doesn't take green like at all. Again, this is not an entire plant. This is one pigment, and most plants have a variety of pigments working together. For example, carrots have a lot of a pigment called carotenoids, which are orange. So those would reflect orange, and they can absorb some green. Okay. So then the confusing vocab term that goes with absorption is action. So the action spectrum is all the pigments. Absorption is one pigment. Action is all the pigments. And hopefully that makes sense. Action is bigger. So action's going to be bigger. That's all the pigments working together to absorb a lot more wavelengths of light. So, so the important thing here, you need this drawn and labeled as well. The important thing here is we don't go all the way to 0 at green. So it's no longer 0 at green because some pigments other than chlorophyll can absorb green. Still not very well, but to some extent. So this is action, all the pigments. Absorption was one pigment. Okay. So this graph doesn't make sense because action spectrum includes all the pigments. So if we're using chlorophyll in the plant, there's no way all the pigments working together are going to be worse at absorbing. That doesn't make any sense, right? So absorption should be shorter at all points because it's part of that. And then the three factors that go into light. This should make a lot of sense with the effect of these things on enzyme activity because everything needs enzymes. It all uses proteins. So with low temperature, you don't have enough energy for any reactions to happen. And then as we increase temperature, we're getting more and more reaction. And then at a high temperature, plant proteins get denatured. So that's temperature. And then for light, a little bit different. No light, no photosynthesis. How are you supposed to split water if you don't have light? And then, but as you increase it, the difference here is it doesn't drop because light is not toxic to a plant, right? If you shine a ton of light on it, it's like, all right, that's all we can use. And then the other light will just reflect, not react with it, with any of the chlorophyll. Okay. And then CO2, similar to light, it's not toxic to a plant. If you throw a ton of CO2 at it, it's not going to kill the plant. It's just not going to do anything more than throwing a decent amount of CO2 at it. Okay, you could make an argument if this was an aquatic plant, it would probably drop because if you put a bunch of CO2 into water, it makes it acidic. And once you change the pH, you can denature proteins. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to talk about is how we can measure photosynthesis. So real simple, just take an aquatic plant, put it underwater, and as it produces oxygen, oxygen is nonpolar, so it doesn't dissolve very well in water. The oxygen bubbles out. You use a funnel to direct the oxygen bubbles into this test tube. Okay, so that's just what this is saying. The only key thing here is you use an inverted test tube. Pretty simple. You just fill it with water. As the oxygen bubbles into it, it pushes water out of it. Pretty simple. And then an easy way to change an independent variable and ask what is the effect of changing the CO2 concentration on plant growth is you can just boil the water. You can just heat it up. Because the hotter the water, the less gas can dissolve in it. It's just like you take a soda and you leave it out on a hot day, it's going to be flat. Because as it heats up, the water molecules move around a little faster and they can't hold on to gas as well, and the gas gets released due to that increased motion of the water molecules. Okay, and that's it.